In the 13th century BCE, somewhere between 1290 and 1230 approximately, an ancient Egyptian official received a gift. The official was a high-ranking military commander overseeing a fortress on the western edge of Egypt's Nile Delta. And he received this gift, possibly, from the pharaoh himself, the great king of the two lands, Usir Ma'at-Ra Setep-En-Ra, known today as Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great. The sword was bronze, made from a single piece of metal from handle to tip. It had a straight blade and a long ridge, or rib, running down the center of that blade to provide stability. And on either side of that rib, the metalworkers had engraved hieroglyphs, including the cartouches of the great king himself. The official probably received this gift as a recognition for good service, and perhaps an encouragement to greater loyalty and effort on behalf of the crown. 3,000 years later, archaeologists found that sword. It was buried in the ruins of this particular fortress, and when the discovery was announced in September 2024, it ran around the world on headlines and blogs. The Sword of Ramesses, so called, seemed to be a beautiful emblem of ancient military technology and efforts to defend the Nile Valley. It is also unusually well preserved, both in its physical properties and in its wider context. But what is the significance of this discovery, really? What is the importance of the wider excavation for our understanding of Egypt at the time of its imperial height? In this episode, I'd like to do a brief exploration of that topic and how the sword fits in to a larger military history. The sword has a straight blade, which might be surprising. Aren't Egyptian swords curved? Yes, one of the famous Egyptian weapons is the sickle-shaped sword, which is called the chepesh, or kopesh. But they did have straight-blade weapons as well. They come in different sizes, but the swords are usually what we would call a short sword, about half a meter or 1 arm length from handle to tip. So these are close combat weapons, larger than daggers, but nothing like a great big Zweihander. You can find these swords in various museums, and I will put some links in the episode description. Obviously, the classic Egyptian sword is that kopesh, but these straight blades do appear in archaeology and also in art quite frequently, so they had a larger arsenal than you might be expecting. The sword itself was discovered at a site called Tel Abqain. This is about 75 kilometers southeast of Alexandria, and it is located on the western edge of the Nile Delta, the great river basin that flows out into the Mediterranean. The site of Tel Abqain is currently under excavation by an Egyptian team, but surveys and small-scale digs have taken place here in the 1980s and 1990s. So we actually have a decent chunk of information about this site and the larger significance of these forts. In 2024, the Egyptian team announced the discovery of mud brick barracks, the soldiers' housing and their domestic area. This included storehouses for weapons and cooking areas where they could keep and prepare food for their nourishment. The archaeologists also found all kinds of artifacts. This included the remains of animal bones from when they were preparing their food. And it included the soldiers' personal effects. This included weapons, like hunting tools, and their decorations, like necklaces, beads, and scarabs or amulets that they might wear for protection and safety. The excavators also found some inscribed material, including one piece of stone that referenced an official named Bai or Bey. We'll come back to him a little bit later. The barracks complex is regularly planned. It's divided into 2 separate areas with a street running down the middle, and the houses are regularly arranged facing out onto that street. This type of orderly planning is quite common in settlements that were designed and built by the Egyptian government. In a town that grew organically, things tend to be messy, streets curve and go here and there, and houses are all different shapes and sizes. But in the government sites, fortresses, and communities designed for a specific purpose, we find this more regular design, with long straight streets and houses or buildings facing off of them, usually of nearly identical design, size, and shape. So we get a sense of a well-organized military machine with a very specific template for building these planned communities. I'm going to explore that in more detail in future episodes, but the fortress at Tal Abqain is a classic planned settlement of the Egyptian government type. Basically, the excavation currently ongoing has uncovered a major domestic center within a large fortified settlement. The fortress at Tal Abqain is well-defined, well-organized, and serving a specific purpose. Tal Abqain is not the only fortress in this region. In fact, there are several, all dating to the 19th dynasty and the reign of Ramesses II specifically. Numerous researchers have studied these forts, both in archaeology and from ancient inscriptions, and we have a decent idea about their functions and their purpose. Ramesses II, or at least his government, established a line of fortresses along the western edge of the Nile Delta. You can find these fortresses running along the edge of the delta itself and then along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. The forts go as far west as El Alamein and Mersa Matruh, which may be familiar to fans of the Second World War desert campaigns. And at the very western limit, a major site called Zawiyat el Rakam guarded the coastal road, as well as the inland routes that head into the Sahara, and the sea lanes that connect North Africa with Crete. Fortresses like these were all built and operated during the time of Ramesses II. Some of them are huge, up to 20,000 square meters, and they have massive walls, barracks, and storage facilities. The fortresses even have their own temples, which are dedicated to patron deities, and partly to the king himself. The fortresses all have strategic locations. Tal Abqain, for example, is built around a watering hole, with a series of wells used to supply travelers who were heading out into the wilderness. The forts also turn up at the junction points of desert roads, and at the natural harbors or ports along the coast. So the soldiers living in these forts were not just hunkering down, occupying territory. They were patrolling the hinterland, trading with locals and foreigners, and delivering goods back to the Nile Valley. So the forts served as intersections for outsiders and Egyptians communicating in different ways. But of course there was that military component. High, thick walls and soldiers are not just pretty, they are there to keep things out. So who were the Egyptians guarding against? The first enemy were the Libyans. Now, we use that term based on geography, people living in the modern state of Libya. But the ancient Egyptians did not view them that way. Artistic scenes and written sources give a variety of names for different groups within this region. This includes the Chechenu, the Libu, the Meshwesh, the Kechek, the Ma, the Has, and many more. So we call them Libyans as kind of an umbrella term based on geography, but their genuine culture and heritage was more diverse and varied. The ancient Egyptian government took a strong interest in the lands to the west. The desert roads, the oases, and the peoples of the Sahara were always a matter of concern. Most of the time, things were peaceful. Trade between the Nile Valley and the Sahara communities was common, and this was recorded in writing, art, and archaeology. But sometimes there was violence, and in the 13th century BCE, the Egyptian pharaohs were waging periodic warfare against the tribes and communities of Libya. The father of Ramesses II, King Seti I, had done this in grandiose fashion, recording a large-scale raid or campaign into the western hinterlands. I covered these events in episode 191, but long story short, around 1300 BCE, the royal army and the kings were taking an aggressive attitude to their neighbors. Then there was another group, a group of people who did not come from the desert, but rather came from the sea. The northern border of Egypt is water, the long shoreline of the Mediterranean. This connects their land to the islands and distant countries across the wider region. That coastline is quite long, with many places to land ships and to bring trade or settlers trying to enter the Nile Valley. It could also bring warriors. The issue of raiders coming from the sea was a growing problem for the Egyptians around this time. It had started almost a century earlier in what we call the 18th dynasty, when royal officials had recorded foreigners coming to the mouth of the River Nile. In one instance, a high-ranking government official named Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, described an engagement with these sea-born invaders. Amenhotep Hapu said, quote, "I was the supreme chief before the brave ones, the soldiers. I put troops at the head of the road in order to repel the foreigners from their places. I did the same on the river mouth, surrounded by my troops and separate from the royal sailors. I led the way. My troops trust in my commands." End quote. In other words, Amenhotep Hapu had led Egyptian marines or a naval fleet against people trying to enter the Nile River from the sea. He doesn't give this group a specific name, but he proudly describes himself defeating them. In the decades that followed, we get glimpses here and there of these coastal raiders. Some of them show up in the Amarna period, the time of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and they're recorded in art that includes people who might be Mycenaeans from Greece, serving as bodyguards for the Egyptian pharaoh, or possibly acting as raiders on the borders of the country. Finally, another group of these sea peoples actually served King Ramesses himself. In some of his inscriptions and his artistic scenes, Ramesses shows a group of people called the Sherden, acting as his bodyguards and elite warriors. The Sherden, or Shardana, are famous as part of the Sea Peoples group, who, several decades after Ramesses II, would try to launch a major invasion of the Nile Valley. Those are all stories for the future, but the point is, the fortresses along the western edge of the Nile Delta, those were partly built to control the movements of these peoples. The Sea Peoples did not just try to enter the Nile Valley from the Nile. Sometimes they tried to come from the coast, further out to the east and west. So the fortress at Tel Abqain and others in this region are, at least partly, designed to guard against the Sea Peoples. That is a very brief summary of some large and complex stories. I'm going to explore those tales in as much detail as I can in the future. But for now, you get the idea. This bronze sword of Ramesses II was discovered in a prominent fortress site on the edge of the Nile Delta. That fortress is one of several built within this region to control the movement of foreign peoples, to provide stopping places for travelers, to facilitate trade with the communities living on the sea and in the Sahara, and finally, they served that military purpose, a bastion to repel enemies, and a launching point for Egyptian military campaigns. The garrison at Tel Abqain, where this sword was discovered, is part of a large and well-organized system of fortifications. Finally, we come to the big question that is implied by many of the headlines announcing this discovery. Is the sword actually Ramesses' sword? That is, did it belong to the king himself? Well, probably not. The king's personal weaponry, the items he genuinely treasured and used, likely would have gone with him into his tomb in the Valley of the Kings at Waset or Thebes. This is far to the south, a long way from Tel Abqain and the northern fortresses. Technically, it's not impossible that this was a lesser sword of the king, or maybe it came from the arsenals at Pi Ramesses, the royal capital in the eastern delta. Maybe it wound up in this fortress after the reign of Ramesses. All of that is possible, but it's relatively unlikely that it belonged to the pharaoh himself. The king's personal swords, and his bows, his armor, his chariots, etc., probably went into his tomb, just like archaeologists found in the burial of Tutankhamun in 1922. Unfortunately, unlike the tomb of Tutankhamun, the burial of Ramesses II was looted and robbed extensively in the declining years of the Egyptian Empire. In those circumstances, all of Ramesses' personal weapons were probably stolen, melted down, and then used for trade or new objects. Metal is valuable at any point in history, so Ramesses' personal weapons are probably long gone. So if it doesn't belong to Ramesses himself, whose is it? Well, scholarly research on the fortresses does show that their commanders were relatively high-ranking. They had titles like Emira Chasut, or the Overseer of Foreign Lands, and while they were not top tier in the government, they were certainly privileged individuals with access to power and wealth. In context, the sword probably belongs to the fortress commander of Tel Abqain, or at least a high-ranking military leader of a nearby region. He might have been the official named Bai or Bey, whose name showed up in inscriptions in the recent discovery. That is just hypothetical at the moment, but the fortress commanders are well recorded, and scholars have studied them extensively. If you are interested in this aspect of Egyptian society, I have done some episodes recently on their armed forces and what we know about some of their leaders, and I'll put some references in the description of this episode if you would like to learn more. Anyway, the sword discovered at Tel Abqain probably doesn't belong to Ramesses himself, but he may have given it to the commander of this fortress. A weapon like this, of high-quality metal and stamped with the names and titles of Ramesses, might indicate that it was a reward dispensed by the pharaoh to one of his high-ranking officials. In the days of Ramesses II and the kings just before him, we have numerous artistic scenes that show the ruler bestowing gifts upon his followers. These gifts are usually given for good service or to ensure their continued loyalty and effort on behalf of the crown. So it's entirely possible that this was given by Ramesses himself to the leader of this fortress or military institution. Again, that is just speculative on the current evidence, but we do know that the pharaohs gave gifts like these. So that might be an explanation for how it wound up at the fort. With that, we come to the end of what we know for now. The excavation at Tel Abqain will probably continue for several more years, and hopefully there will be a large-scale archaeological publication in the not-too-distant future. And certainly, we're going to explore the string of fortresses that protected the Western Desert during the time of Ramesses himself. So, if you are interested in this discovery, or the ancient Egyptian military in general, we will be discussing that a great deal more on the History of Egypt podcast. For now, this brings me to the end of this discovery. I hope you have enjoyed this little exploration, and I look forward to sharing more tales with you. Thanks for listening.